Hey there, John Rollison here, and I want to talk to you for a minute about Jesus Christ and the resurrection. And the reason I want to talk to you about it is because Jesus is the most influential person that ever lived. No doubt about that. And if true, the resurrection of Jesus is of the greatest consequence ever. So, I want to talk to you about some evidence, but I understand that the resurrection of Jesus is an amazing claim. And amazing claims require amazing evidence, right? That's all good. So that's what we're going to do. Just for like 4 or 5 minutes here. We're going to try and run through these really quick. It might go 8 or 10. It's not going to go more than 10 for sure. So, stay with me here. So, first of all, let's talk about some objections to the resurrection. Some people say that the women went to the wrong tomb. They went to the wrong tomb, and there it was empty, and they said, oh, he's been raised. That is the kind of thing that is said by people who haven't actually read the text. Because the text gives us several pretty much ironclad reasons to expect that they did not go to the wrong tomb. In the book of Matthew, we're told that the women watched Jesus being buried. So they had followed the body when it was taken down and watched where it was buried. Why? Because they planned to come back after the Sabbath to do the anointing of the body with all the burial spices, because it was too late in the day to do that now. So they watched him be buried, and then they left. The second thing is they knew whose tomb it was. We are told that there was a rich man who was a follower of Jesus named Joseph of Arimathea, who is also mentioned in Monty Python in the Search for the Holy Grail. And he had a tomb that had been cut out of rock that hadn't been used for anything yet. And so he asked Pilate for the body, and they put the body in the tomb. So the women watched him being buried. We know who owned the tomb. So the idea that they went to the wrong tomb and found it empty is kind of an empty idea. Also, there were burial cloths there. They happened to go to the wrong tomb. It was empty, but it had like burial cloths laying on the body slab there. No, it's so unlikely to have that they went to the wrong tomb that's almost absurd. So what's the next thing? Jesus wasn't raised. The tomb wasn't in fact empty. Here's the problem with that. The disciples asserted that the tomb was empty and that Jesus had been raised. And if Jesus wasn't raised when the disciples said he was raised, and you were one of the chief priests, what would you do? Well, you would march over to the tomb, and you would roll that stone away, and you would get the body of Jesus and bring it out and say, you say he's raised, I say he isn't, and here's the body. But no one ever did that. So it seems very unlikely that the tomb wasn't empty. So they didn't go to the wrong tomb, and the tomb wasn't empty. The tomb was empty, because if it wasn't empty, the leaders would have just shown the body of Jesus. So the next thing we might say is, well, if they went to the right tomb and it was empty, then maybe the disciples stole the body. Well, here's the thing. In Matthew, I think it's Matthew. I have to go back and check. The accounts in the scriptures tell us that the chief priests were worried about this very thing. And so they went to Pilate, and they asked Pilate, they said, listen, they're going to go there and take his body in the middle of the night and say he's been raised. And then that's going to be a worse problem than we had before. And Pilate said, okay, take a guard with you, go make the tomb as secure as you can. So the leaders, the religious leaders, had at their disposal a Roman guard to guard the tomb. So they went and they put a Roman guard in front of the tomb, and they sealed the tomb. And if I remember right, it even had the Roman governor's seal on it, which was a serious penalty, possibly even death, for breaking that without authorization. So the tomb is sealed and guarded by Roman guards. And the idea that the disciples stole the body is the assertion that a tomb guarded by Roman guards could be raided by 3 or 4 fishermen and a tax collector and a few other people. Okay, so that's already ridiculous. But the tomb, if it's the right tomb, and it was empty, and the burial clothes were there, who's going to unwrap a body? Who's going to unwrap the body of their master and carry it away naked and leave the burial clothes there? That's not going to happen. Also, the idea that the disciples of Jesus, who were in locked rooms because they were afraid of the religious leaders, would conceive of and hatch a plan as courageous as attacking an armed Roman guard to steal the body of their master and pretend he'd been raised, that's really reaching. That's what I would say. That's really reaching. And to top it all off, the idea that the disciples stole the body doesn't really mesh with the reality of human character. You could say maybe they, putting aside all the Roman guard and leaving the burial cloths and everything else, maybe they stole the body. Is it reasonable to assume that they stole the body, said he was raised, and continued to hold on to their story for 4 decades as they were imprisoned and tortured and ultimately killed? 11 out of 12 of them saying that Jesus had been raised. Is that reasonable? The answer to that is that it's not. Now, I know that we've had a few things. They got the Jonestown thing and the guys who thought they were going to ride the comet. But that's where their sort of charismatic and kooky leader was there with them and leading them in their self-imposed death, right? In what this is a bunch of people saying they saw Jesus alive, holding on to that story for 4 decades, all of them, holding on to that story even to the point of death. Why would they do that unless they were firmly convinced that they had all seen Jesus alive afterward? So there's that. Charles Colson was Nixon's hatchet man during Watergate, and here's what he says about the resurrection. He says, "I know the resurrection is a fact, and Watergate proved it to me." How? Because 12 men testified they had seen Jesus raised from the dead, and then they proclaimed that truth for 40 years, never once denying it. Every one of them was beaten, tortured, and stoned, and put in prison. Some of them were different things. They all ended up martyred, except one, by the way. They would not have endured that if it weren't true. Watergate embroiled 12 of the most powerful men in the world, and they couldn't keep alive for 3 weeks. You are telling me that 12 apostles, not to mention the others, could keep alive for 40 years? That's absolutely impossible. And in this, I would actually add Charles Colson's own life as a testimony to the living Christ that impacts people's lives, because he was not a nice man. And then Christ got a hold of him, and he did so much good in the second half of his life. That alone is a testimony. So, okay, so the women didn't go to the wrong tomb. That's ridiculous to think about. The tomb wasn't empty. That's ridiculous to think about. The disciples stole the body from the Roman guards. That's ridiculous to think about. So what if they just made the whole thing up? I mean, what if the whole Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, and Acts is kind of, what if they made up the whole thing? Well, there's a lot of historical problems with that. One is that we actually have manuscripts that date pretty early, and unlike other literature where you're moving further and further away, because of archaeology, we're actually getting earlier and earlier manuscripts and learning more and more accurately about things that have to do with the scriptures. And the earliest people, when these were written, there were people alive who were eyewitnesses. So that kind of makes it way too early for myths to be developing of this kind. And a guy named Will Durant, who is a historian of such note that he wrote a book called The Story of Civilization, 11 volumes, wrote about the idea that the whole thing is a myth. And this is what he wrote: "The denial of that existence seems never to have occurred even to the bitterest Gentile or Jewish opponents of nascent Christianity." So what he's saying is nobody ever denied there was a Jesus and that all these things happened. They didn't even deny the miracles. They just didn't want people following Jesus, and mostly it's because they would take away their power. That is a natural human thing, is it not? So the idea that they made up the whole thing, it's too well documented. The manuscripts are too soon after the asserted resurrection of Jesus. And the manuscripts, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, especially Luke, but all of them to a certain degree, less so John than the others, they don't read like myths and legends either. If you're making up a myth and a legend, if you think of the great stories, they start out like once upon a time or in a land far, far away or whatever like that. And they go through sweeping things. They're not written like this. Here's what C.S. Lewis had to say. C.S. Lewis, by the way, was an atheist who slowly became a theist and finally became a Christian quite later in life. And he was long before he became a Christian, he was a world-renowned scholar of medieval literature. And here's what he has to say about the Gospels. "I've been reading poems, romances, vision literature, legends, myths all my life. I know what they are like. I know that not one of them is like this." And like in Luke, he says who was the emperor, who was the governor, who was the tetrarch. He grounds the whole thing in history. So the idea that these are all made up, they don't read like stuff made up. They're not written. The people who wrote them are put historical events in there, which would indicate they're not being made up as a myth too. And they just have they were written too soon after Jesus to be considered a myth. So one more thing that people often say when they are not wanting to think about the resurrection and consider it, the resurrection of Jesus. They say it's impossible. It can't have happened because it can't happen. That's called circular reasoning. It can't happen because it can't happen. It can't happen because things like that are impossible. That's called restating your presupposition. If you're going to do that, that's fine. Just make sure you are aware of what you are doing. Because what you are doing is saying, I have this view of life, the universe, and everything, and something was alleged to have happened that doesn't fit into my view, and so therefore it can't have happened. That's bad science, my friends. We live in a time and an age when lots of things that seem impossible are yet apparently true. Subatomic particles, electrons. They're not exactly particles, evidently, from what I understand, but they also appear and then disappear and then appear somewhere else without going through the space between. We live in a universe that, based on our inference of what's happening, is filled with energy and matter that we can't detect. Over 90% of the universe is apparently, at least under the current model, dark energy and dark matter. We are still finding species on the Earth that we didn't know existed. And so when you say that can't happen because things like that just don't happen, if you want to say that, fine. But just be aware of what you're doing. All you're doing is saying, I have a worldview and I'm not willing to have it challenged. There are people who have decided that they're done with Jesus and someone needs to tear this guy down and destroy the myth once for all. And you know what happens? Many times they end up followers of Jesus Christ. So that's what I would say to you in regards to Easter. And I know I went way longer than 2 or 3 minutes. My timer says that I'm at about 14. So if you're still with me, thank you very much. Again, my name is John Rallison, and it turns out I'm the pastor of a church called Journey of Life. It's a church in the Lake Nona area of Orlando, Florida, and our website is journeyoflife.org. And I'd sure enjoy it if you contact me, or if you want to come and visit our church, or yeah, share my video if you want to. Again, feel free to contact me. My email is contact@journeyoflife.org. And again, sure appreciate you watching all the way to the end. And have a good one.